we've just been listening to a giant of the Western intellectual tradition, Minister, Michael Ignatieff, whose work at Central European University has seen academic freedom being stretched by a democratically elected government. And when we come and think about free speech, the left in British university life tends to think this is all a put-up job, and there is no really serious issue there about freedom of speech and thought and research. But on the other hand, Michael Ignatieff thinks there is, and thinks that freedom of speech is increasingly under threat in the West. What do you think?
So, ever since I've been appointed as Universities Minister, I've been trying to look afresh to reset the dial of the government's relationship with the sector. And I think on the issue of freedom of speech, we did reach a point where the issue was becoming overtly politicised, that the temperature was being raised in a way that I felt uncomfortable coming in as a new Universities Minister. And I think I was fortunate in that sort of my arrival as Universities Minister also coincided a couple of weeks later with the EHRC guidance on free speech, simply just dispassionately setting out the legal framework of what existed in law, what did not exist in law, because I think there were a number of individual cases where claims were made over transgressions on free speech in law, and that possibly didn't stack up as a legal argument. And so that guidance being published, independent guidance, was work that was taken forwards both with the OFS, with the support of the National Union for Students, and I welcome that. I think it's helped sort of lower the temperature. I'm the last person who would sort of claim that the universities are somehow left-wing madrasas, that students are somehow being forced into thinking in certain ways, and I want to ensure that in the same way that we increase diversity on campus, as Michael Ignatieff pointed to, recognising diversity of opinion and diversity of thought is equally important, and we've got to strike that balance. On the other hand, I see there's sort of stories in the Guardian today on a HEPI publication around sort of prevent and the government's role in potentially limiting free speech. And I would say, to address concerns over these issues, that on the one hand, yes, we will be reviewing issues around prevents and the guidance for the future to make sure that we continue to maintain free speech, but also we can't allow for hate speech and hate crime to be committed on universities. And I'm very interested and concerned about where do you see that balance between free speech moving into hate speech and making sure we double down on intolerance and discrimination and racism within universities. And that's where my letter to Vice Chancellors on adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is specifically not to limit free speech, but to protect the rights of Jewish students, just as I want to protect the rights of Muslim students, and make sure that every student has the fullest university experience possible.
So Michael Ignatieff spoke about the life of the mind, the life of the pure pursuit of knowledge and the ability to communicate knowledge, and the fact that universities at their best, and he said that we have the leading universities in Europe and possibly in the world in this country, and thank you for the job that you are doing championing the cause of universities. But he also spoke about the worry that universities can be seen by governments to be merely employment factories. Are, Minister, universities more than employment factories? And if so, what will you be doing to remind us about the moral, scholarly, academic and intellectual responsibilities of universities?
So I think coming back to Michael Ignatieff's point, speaking from Hungary there just goes to demonstrate the international importance of our university and HE sector and why it's important that we don't have a cognitive dissonance in government between recognizing the worldwide global value of our higher education tertiary system. The latest QS rankings were published. We maintain the 18 of the top 100 universities. I think one of my favorite statistics is, even if you're taking those universities aside, the 97% of all UK's universities are in the top 5% of global universities. So we can't celebrate that and at the same time overtly claim that we should criticise the sector for somehow not generating certain graduate outcomes that may be wished for or wanted for. I support the production of data, the increased production of data. I think that sort of the creation of OFS and the transparency duty will allow for more data to be available to make policy-making decisions for the future. And we're living in that data revolution, and the longitudinal education's outcome data, which points to the graduate outcomes of certain courses, certain institutions. Obviously, the latest data was published yesterday. There's a bit of a time lag because that's from 2016, 2017. I don't want to be in an Orwellian scenario of an organisation, something called Leo, telling politicians how to think and governments how to make policy. It's still my responsibility as Universities Minister to be able to work with the sector, to help co-create with the sector, reflecting upon their institutional autonomy, that we have these strong institutions that, as a government, how can we help support them? And when it comes to the issue of graduate outcomes, and I was somebody who became a Member of Parliament a week short of my 29th birthday. I wasn't expecting necessarily to get elected. Now, why do I raise that? Because we know that the final chop on Leo is at age 29, what is your graduate salary? And therefore it will cast backwards and then value a course on its quality based on that graduate outcome. Now, if I hadn't got elected as Member of Parliament on whenever it was the 5th of May, 2010, I would probably be on a graduate salary of about £10,000 because I was working part-time as a teaching support assistant at Bristol University and sort of part-time, writing a book on Elizabeth I. So my own experience just goes to show that not the inadequacy of that data, but the need to be able to take a human calculation on that data and not to read off the data as if it was a sort of machine-based process by which we would simply cast sheep from goats as a result. Leo will, over time, become better. A bit like sort of that TV program 7 Up. We're going to suddenly follow through.
But they're all dying.
Well, I think all I'm keen to ensure is that we're now at sort of aged 29, going on to 34, and it's particularly for the humanities and for the arts, where the industrial strategies really recognise the importance of the creative arts sector. I mean, £102 billion GVA to the economy. We know that it reduces £10.2 billion annually, recurrently, and some of those courses do take time to be able to demonstrate sort of career paths. But even with that in mind, if I decided to remain a Tudor historian rather than become a Member of Parliament and a minister, I would have then still been content on a salary of maybe potentially under £25,000 if I was feeling that I was contributing to the sum of increasing human knowledge. I'm a failed academic. I never finished my DPhil. I went off to write popular history books. But I wanted to become an academic to start with because I knew the social value of becoming an academic also would meet the opportunities to contribute to society beyond paying tax, beyond having that salary threshold. And so we've got to maintain, for the sake of our own humanity, that opportunity not to be drawn into, as I say, into that Orwellian calculation of simply relying on Leo to tell us how to think.
Okay, so a education secretary famously 15 years ago queried the value in universities of Tudor history and I mean, surely isn't it all a bit of a waste of time and indulgence? I mean, you could have studied financial accounting.
I could have. I think whether I've been any good at it would be a different question. But I think that points to talent and how do you define talent? And how can we, across both nationally and internationally, explore creating that sort of freedom of talent? And that comes down partly to how we explore a more flexible immigration system. But going back to talent and how people can capture the best of their talents, I think is an important one. And that element of fulfillment of ensuring that everyone has. I passionately believe that there is a role for every individual in society, and finding that role for them. It may not be the first time as well. Actually, I know individuals who maybe study one course, take a wrong turning, have to retrain until they find their vocation and calling in life. And that's where I think I'm determined to ensure that it would be a sad world if we all worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers.
How can I possibly comment? How does it make you a different universities minister, in that you're very, very rare, Chris, in being somebody who's been a scholar? You have been at the very frontiers of knowledge. Does that make you a different kind of universities minister? Do you get us better or differently?
Well, I mean, I care deeply about the sector, having seen individuals who work in it, and moving that dial, as I said, towards a narrative that recognises the value of research, which I don't think is often necessarily understood in political circles. The ability to create and to invent, and as Michael Ignatieff pointed to, establish new forms of knowledge, knowing that knowledge isn't necessarily static. And actually, I think I've come to the job actually at a relatively unique point in history, knowing that we're going through a revolution in new forms of technology, new forms of AI that actually make the case for investing in knowledge in ways that previously maybe settled forms of liberal arts versus STEM, it's all been shaken up, and we've got to sort of tap into that opportunity to be able to make the case for both humanities and social sciences, not sort of tacked on to STEM as sort of STEAM, but sort of running right the way through human investigation, human understanding. But I feel, as somebody who studied at postgraduate level, that balance that recognises that universities are not big schools. It recognises that universities simply aren't there to teach. Many will confuse a university experience with simply being about teaching. And I'm determined to make sure that we can explore what that wider ecosystem means, that knowledge and the imparting of knowledge is not simply about that sort of teaching opportunity. It's about the wider experience across a 3-year, 4-year life course, and how we can really demonstrate in government that is meaningful and is recognised.
You mentioned AI Minister, and Joseph Aoun of Northeastern is talking, just coming up shortly, about that transformative impact, and it will be totally and utterly transformative. Universities don't understand it fully yet, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not going to come. Minister, the sector badly needs a champion, somebody who can stand up in Whitehall and Westminster and say, you know what, universities are bloody important. They're important to society, to the economy, to the cohesion of the nation, to civilization, to values, to independence of thought. We need somebody, and I cannot remember somebody who has made a very big impact. Now, you clearly understand what universities in all their fullness are about. The previous universities ministers who have been here at the festival, Joe Johnson came and was gone a short while after he was here. Sam Jima was here last year and left soon after. Can we hope that you will still be here speaking to us next year? And what will you look back on as the Skidmore effect?
Well, I ideally hope to still be in my job. Obviously, it's a time of political uncertainty.
Is it?
I think
Goodness.
Anthony asked me what was on my mind when I first arrived here, and I said 27 days, because obviously we'll know in 27 days was the reshuffle begins, whoever becomes Prime Minister. I'm in a one-man race, I think, to try and hold on to my job, I say. I'd dearly love to be able to continue. It is important. There's that delicate balance of how do you ensure there's institutional memory, and we have fantastic civil service who are able to provide me with support when it comes to that. But I think when it comes also to an international perspective, having a stability and an opportunity for a minister might last longer than a year is important when it comes to looking at, when I'm off to Finland next week for the EU Competitiveness Council, I'm meeting other HE ministers, research ministers who've been in post for 4 years or more. Yep. And, they have that advantage of, that deep ingrained knowledge. And I'm trying to sort of scrub up as fast as I can. But I think what is also important to recognise, putting aside personalities and putting aside politics to an extent, is making sure there is that strategy in place. And I do think that the industrial strategy does provide a real key opportunity for universities. And the next stage of the industrial strategy is clearly the establishment of local industrial strategies. We've seen the publication of the West Midlands local industrial strategy, the Greater Manchester local industrial strategy. There are other local industrial strategies that are currently being developed, so I'm hoping they'll be shortly published ASAP. But the first one to be published, the West Midlands industrial strategy, was launched at Warwick University. And how can we ensure, and obviously these have a bit of overlap, and these are the first ones because they're covering the mayoralty areas, that when it comes to local devolution and the futures of local devolution and future skills devolution, that universities, they are magnets. And as part of my commitment towards trying to get to 2.4% of GDP being spent on research development, both obviously public and private, 2/3 private, we've got to draw in that private investment, and universities are the best single co-locator to do that. I mean, I've visited about 35 universities since December, and the most innovative work I've seen is where universities have naturally have the opportunity to establish themselves, establish research institutes and centres that then companies from abroad are then looking to invest and often sort of bring a ratio for every pound spent. Now we're getting to the £2.50 return from a private investment. But I guess my legacy, I don't want to necessarily talk about my legacy, but the sort of
don't worry, I'll write the book about it. I want it to be a great book for universities. We all do.
No, I think in terms of what I've been obviously had to take forward is you have that sort of the curve, don't you, of politics, these wheels of fortune, and David Willetts had the fortune of coming in as sort of coalition minister, being there for 4 years, bringing a host of innovative new opportunities to develop new research funds. Joe Johnson came in, and obviously he was the minister who legislated for HERA, and I've been the minister obviously who've had to sort of look at implementing the tail end of HERA and the establishment of OFS and the access and participation plans. That can be frustrating because I've got my own vision about what I think could be done for the future and how we can continue to make the case for more nuanced reforms and better use of data. I feel that the 2.4% legacy is also going to be critical for investment in universities, and trying to make sure that we land a spending review settlement is also something behind the scenes at the moment. I've been determined to even try to do better than my old boss David Willetts, and when it comes to QR funding, to try and get an uplift on that. I really want to be a minister who's seen as somebody who, at a time when higher education potentially could come under attack, was able to move away that threat and allow for continued investment in knowledge and research. And I think the frustration sometimes as a politician is you make public announcements, but you'll never see what goes on behind the scenes in terms of negotiating and preventing certain policies from happening. And obviously I was delighted that the minimum entry requirement never featured in the Auger review, and I was determined to make sure as a universities minister that I would continue and to defend the sector of its right to be able to have that autonomy when it came to deciding on admissions criteria, and not to penalise students who happened, from whatever background, not to maybe artificially reach a cut at A-level grades because of maybe mental health background, maybe coming from family circumstances, domestic violence, a host of reasons. But things like that may seem a small achievement, but are an important long-term achievement in making sure we don't allow any slide to take place.
Okay, last question. We're going to come open. The most effective ministers are those who think about their current job, not the next one, and keeping their heads under the parapet. They are the ones who talk with an inner authenticity and conviction about what it is they believe in. And if the Prime Minister wants to get rid of them, well, so be it. But if they talk about it well enough, that won't happen. We need to have a champion. I'm sure we'll come back to that at questions, but let's just have a quick word about inclusivity and widening access, 'cause I think you've got something here to tell us.
Yes, so one of my priorities coming into the role is obviously to look again at access and participation. We've obviously got the establishment of the OFS, access and participation plans. Fantastic work, being done by Chris Millward, on looking at sort of what we could be doing for the future. But the strategy I've taken as University Minister is to take certain groups of students and to say, well, let's look, for instance, at disabled students, let's look at visually impaired students, let's look at autistic students, let's look at students from a care leaver background, or even indeed young carers. And if, as the sector, we can highlight best practice and make sure that we can focus on these groups, we will actually disproportionately widen access, but importantly participation. And I think AMP, while important, we will move on to a new narrative eventually. I'm really keen to focus not just on getting students through the door. It's what happens when they're at university that's so crucial. So where do we go with participation? And I have this idea of saying, let's move on from participation to create what I would like to see as a STEP framework, a student transition and experience and progress framework that would chart the life, well, not the life course, but the course of a student right from getting their application in to the university, to their acceptance, all the way through to those transition moments. And we've had some work done on transitions, and obviously the OFS have now established TASO as the evidence and impact exchange. And I've seen some fantastic examples, University of Brunel, for example, where they've done some great work on adaptive technology for disabled students. But we still have a situation where only 3% of campuses are truly inclusive. And my principle is, if you ensure that from the very start you are thinking about the needs of disabled students, you're thinking about the needs of visually impaired students right from the beginning, naturally by mainstreaming that into the university, you will be adaptive to all issues around access and making sure that actually you're lifting the tide. And so today we have announced the establishment of the Disabled Students Commission, that will be run in conjunction with the OFS. This will be an independent commission that we will appoint members to shortly, and will focus specifically on highlighting best practice and spreading that throughout the sector and making sure that the student voice of disabled students is clearly heard.
We have a disabled student in the front who we're going to hear from later, but Professor Tooley, latterly of Newcastle.
Yeah, so Professor James Tooley, incidentally from born and bred in your constituency, and right. My parents voted for you, so I hope that makes you predisposed
what a creep!
Predisposed to my question. No, I was at Newcastle, as Anthony said, for 21 years, and I've just arrived here in Buckingham. And what strikes you immediately is, from May to September in Newcastle and other universities, there's an extraordinary waste of plant. The offices, the campus is virtually empty. And of course, here in Buckingham, we're famous for our 2-year degrees. Isn't the case for 2-year degrees incontrovertible, given Buckingham's success at this route?
So
that wasn't a plant.
No, I took forward the.
Yeah.
Should I?
Yep. Go ahead.
Took forward the legislation for 2-year degrees that was part again of a spin out from HERA, and so actually I've become regardless of what's said in Augur about reducing the fee cost, when it comes to the fee cost, obviously for 2-year degrees, I've raised it to £11,250, which actually was still a cheaper degree overall over 2 years than the overall cost of a 3-year degree. It wasn't necessarily hothouse students. It's simply, I'm really keen on course flexibility. How can we create an increased menu of options for the student, placing the student at the heart of their learning journey? And so what I've really keen also to make sure we focus on in government is that the student is not necessarily the 18-year-old going to university. We now need to be looking, obviously, at OECD rates of participation for who gets a degree by the time they're 30, which is about 50%, I think, for the UK, which is still under the OECD average. So anyone who says, well, there's too many students going to university, I wholeheartedly disagree. I think when we come to look at the modern knowledge economy, when we come to look at the portability of the degree qualification, it's important that we don't devalue that value of having the degree. what I'm keen to look at is those pathways to the final degree may be varied and different, and that we celebrate difference, and that we recognise that that route should work for the student, not necessarily for the institution. And so the 45-week increase as opposed to the 30-week increase, that has been achieved by many institutions. Not for every course. It wouldn't work for every course. It wouldn't work for high-intensity courses like engineering, but it works for certain courses, certain degrees. Vocational degrees. When you look at nursing, for example, many students who've gone in as a nursing support assistant who then have decided they want to become a fully qualified nurse. How can they train as fast as possible to be able to achieve their lifetime ambitions? And that's where the 2-year degree, I think, works really well. In St Mary's and Twickenham, they moved to a 2-year degree because they were forced to, because there were theatre production students who were being poached by the West End before they finished their degree, so they were dropping out after 2 years. Actually, the 2-year degree allows for those students to complete their degree, have that qualification, which then is recognised, can be taken internationally across various countries, but it's not putting the student at a disadvantage because the 2-year degree is allowing them to actually achieve their degree and go on and earn money and tick the Leo box of the graduate outcomes as well. But it's one of many opportunities, I think, and I'm very keen on degree apprenticeships. I mean, the frustration I have is degree apprenticeships don't technically sit in my portfolio. I'd love to be able to see opportunities by which we can be working with the Education Skills and Funding Agency on how we can make those more flexible. Or if you go to Aston and the placement year, of which 70% of students in Aston take, some just great opportunities example, and obviously Buckingham's pioneered the 2-year degree. How can we mainstream that? How can we ensure that all institutions recognise that actually a increase in an option on the menu is a good thing?
Okay, thank you. So no more questions from or about this university. I'm keen to get as much diversity as possible. Please, yep.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My question is about not so much about the universities themselves, but the other support services, specifically things like student loans company. I'm not convinced that they're set up to fully support students. You mentioned disabled students, for example, students from diverse backgrounds. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that and the future for organisations like SLC.
So the SLC obviously is undergoing a transition as well. They've got their own modernisation programme. I went up to visit them in Glasgow a couple of months ago, and if you look at their computer system, you'll understand why they need that modernisation programme. So obviously there is a question of capacity, which then leads on to capability for the future, and obviously SLC there is I think a inadequacy in the system in that you have obviously ministers coming along wanting to create new products and the SLC having to then adapt to creating those products and giving them the breathing space to be able to modernise without sort of putting a whole host of new ideas for them to cope with. And obviously that's reflective, I think, also on Augur, that how the SLC will be able to make that transition also. So disabled students specifically, I'm very keen obviously on DSA in terms of disabled students' allowances and to make sure that those work for the students. We obviously introduced the postgraduate increase for disabled students to allowance of £20,000, which was down at £10,600, and recognising that the DSA support that's come in recently is now meant retention rates for those students is at 91% compared to 90% for students as an average. So actually it's having successes. But I held a number of round tables recently in Birmingham with visually impaired students, and there's a pattern of concern around making sure that the ability to understand what is on offer is not necessarily articulated early enough. So students are only necessarily applying retrospectively for some of the opportunities for support, and within that, where are the flexibilities for support also, and an issue around some of the technologies that are available. And we've got a review that is ongoing around some of that assistive technology, because sometimes the products that have been supplied are not necessarily suitable, but it's a sort of one-size-fits-all problem. So I'm aware of that as an issue, and I'm determined to make sure that we continue to focus upon it, but mindful that the SLC does have capacity issues as well at the moment.
Thank you, Minister, very much. Questioner here. Yep.
Rosie Bennett from The Times. There are brand new figures out today showing the government stroke taxpayers are now paying 47 pence in the pound for student loans, which is about 7.5 billion a year. Is that value for money for the taxpayer? And given the scale of the taxpayer contribution now, what would you like to see universities do more of with our money? And also, would you like that 47% to come down?
So these are obviously forecast figures that are projecting, ahead to scenarios where we know that no one has ever, with student finances and in its infancy, that we haven't sort of reached final conclusions of knowing sort of where repayments happen to lie. And obviously there are a number of measures in Augar which future Prime Minister, future Education Secretary will need to look at where does the repayment threshold lie, and obviously, we've seen interest from certain candidates around the interest rate. I think when it comes to the role of the taxpayer and what subsidy occurs, it's very clear that obviously the taxpayer continues to provide that subsidy. I think it's an important challenge to those who claim that somehow we can make we can remove university fees in their entirety, because the burden on the taxpayer becomes even more so. But I still feel that regardless of what may be paid or not paid back, and whether you look to extend that repayment threshold from beyond the 30 years, that it's important that we've given those opportunities to people who wouldn't have had that opportunity if they simply had to pay the fees up front. I don't want to get into necessarily a huge debate over the nature of where that might come for the future, because I know that obviously future Prime Ministers may have different ideas about how a repayment mechanism may work for the future. But ultimately, I think that it is good value for money. I think that when you look at international students who come here willing to pay far more for their degrees, they know that they're getting a world-class education. And what are you purchasing here? It's not just for that individual that the taxpayer is helping to finance their opportunity to be able to succeed in life. They're also financing the indirect benefits of the social benefits for every doctor, for every nurse, for every midwife that is trained. They're also subsidising the community benefits that the universities provide for their localities. They are subsidising the opportunity for the UK to remain world leading when it comes to knowledge, and ensuring that we continue to lead the creative arts and to establish the inventors of the future. Take any of these away, and I believe that the taxpayer would turn around and say to a government, what have you done? Why have you allowed for a disinvesting in one of our greatest sectors that we are world leading in? And so, for myself, I believe that it is an investment worth paying for.
Very good. Does that satisfy you, Rosie Bennett of The Times?
I suppose I would like to hear just one sentence. What would you like the university to do more with this?
You're being allowed one sentence there. What would you like universities to be doing more on this with our money?
So I think universities recognise and are about to move towards becoming civic institutions in their localities, and that opportunity to work with access and participation charities, to work with schools on building up the life chances for students, not just in their own institutions but in their schools, and also with the FE colleges. Because if Augar Review tells us anything, it's that opportunity to be able to create a single post-18 landscape that allows for seamless transition between these institutions. But equally, I think there is a role for universities to be working with schools from a lot earlier age, to be open about that and to support that, because that civic mission is going to help defend the value of universities to every taxpayer in this country.
Long sentence, and
Sorry.
I didn't notice, Chris, a single comma in that sentence. Liz Barnes.
Liz Barnes, Staffordshire. Thank you. It's really refreshing to hear a minister, frankly, that understands what a university is about and our role in society and in the economy. And you made a couple of statements that really stood out for me. And one was, we are not large schools. And another was around how apprenticeships should sit under your brief. And I can't help thinking that since we've been moved into the DFE, that the lens that we're considered through and looked at is that of schools. And that's how we've moved into debates that are moving towards policies that are far more befitting schools than reflecting the role that we play in the economy. I'd just be interested in your view as to whether actually we might be far more best placed back in bays.
Well,
Possibly. I don't want to be sort of all coy, but perhaps no comment on that last question. But to say that one of the most sort of realizations that I had, sort of eureka moment, when nothing had been said about the postgraduate education and the education and continued career development of early career researchers by a government minister effectively since 2003. And that just goes to show you these policy black spots when certain groups fall between departments. So you have DFE effectively rolling out to around master's level 7, and then Bayes picking it up on the DPhil PhD level 8. And not how can we look at supporting that career development? That I just found that sort of something that was just really stark, and that's why I did my first speech on 2.4%, focusing on people, supporting sort of Itai's work on what we could do to help, recognising the increasing challenge of early career researchers, because no one said anything on them. And all those issues around non-disclosure agreements, for example, that have allowed to happen, because there's not really been any political pressure or a government minister actually helping to reflect that this is a real-time problem. So, and there's been a number of issues, I guess, from the international side also, of how to make sure that we recognise that when it comes to the international education strategy, and I should say, another legacy I'll be proud of is the publication of the international education strategy, alongside also the publication of international research and innovation strategy, is making sure that departments don't just focus on the pounds and pence of their departments and how that is relatively scored against another part of the department, whether it's the FE sector or whether it's the school sector, because the value and the investment is seen in another department. And that is something which is a real problem in HE, that its ability to be able to generate income as part of our modern knowledge economy is not scored in DFE, it's scored in Bayes. And so that's also another critical issue.
So we have just time for 2 more questions. There's one on international students over there. Mary, kind of very briefly.
Very briefly, integration of further education and higher education, which was very much a theme of the Auger review. I think when you were talking about pathways, you're in favour of that. I just wondered if you could say something about what a more integrated higher and further education system might look like.
And then the one from Sean Coughlin of the BBC.
Thank you very much. Sort of 2 questions in one, if possible. I don't know if you caught Michael Ignatieff's comment on the UK government's lack of reaction to his university being boosted out of Hungary. I don't know if you heard that.
No.
He was suggesting that there was a lack of action, a lack of comment and support. The other point I was going to ask about was about numbers. You said you didn't want to see universities getting smaller, or that there were too many people at university. How big should they get? How many people should go to university?
So how many people should go to university, and the FEHE relatively quickly?
So if I can answer them in reverse order. I guess on the issue of Hungary, there are the ministerial responsibilities, by which obviously I wouldn't necessarily want to comment on a foreign office issue, which I know obviously there's a number of diplomatic sensitivities. But apart from to say, when it comes to supporting European research and to ensuring that we continue partnerships across Europe, I'm determined to be able to make that commitment. You may have seen, when it came to focusing on Horizon 2020, I feel passionately we're going into a no-deal scenario, that we've got to sort of redefine the paradigm by which we should look at disorderly versus orderly Brexit, and that we should focus on an orderly Brexit that would commit to Horizon, commit to Erasmus, commit to home fee status as a package. And so I'm acutely aware that as an academic community, there are no borders, and we should be supporting our academic friends in all countries. I guess on the question of university size, of course, I don't want sort of necessarily universities to be going the way of Italy, where you've got sort of enormous sort of universities, and that sort of necessarily it should though all be about the student experience and making sure that the size of the university reflects the opportunity for every individual student to be content on being able to study. I think there's an issue around commuter students, and there's certain localities around. Manchester has the largest number of commuter students. What could we be doing more of as a government to try and help recognise their learning journeys and to support them? On that point, I guess around the unity between FE and HE. Now, I'm acutely conscious there are many areas in the country that are doing an excellent job, and one of the things I'm always careful not to stand on eggshells here is not to sort of say you come up with an idea that's already being trialled or tested elsewhere. But I guess the question is partly around creating hub and spoke approach where the feeder FE colleges into a larger HE institution. There's issues around who awards the degree and the franchising process, and obviously there's been reforms from OFS on that, but how FE colleges will have degree awarding powers and whether they need to be fully franchised by a university. Equally, should universities be offering level 4 or 5 qualifications? Because I also believe that the FE sector, no matter how much money you give it, won't actually have the capacity, or certainly the buildings to be able to cope with this. So how can HE provide FE opportunities, provisions for the future? But just one of the quick things to say is simple things like in Loughborough, having the Students' Union being open and the members of that Students' Union being both Loughborough College and the university. Small things like that provide for a opportunity to make sure that FE students are never seen as second class, because we've got to make sure that when it comes to HE and FE, that we are a single purpose, which is to educate that post-18 student to the best ability possible, ultimately to achieving a degree.
So I'm going to say now that before we just thank that this is the most wonderful book here. I'm buying myself a little bit of goodwill from the writer of it. It is the most important book in higher education today, and the speaker is going to be speaking from this stage. We're going to flow straight into it in 2 minutes, and we'll be talking about this. Everyone must buy it, otherwise the speaker is going to be very cross with us all. So that is the book. Minister, note that. And although actually I'm going to give you another book also when you leave. So what I would say is the lesson of the last 3 years is very singular and clear. It is have a vision. If we have a vision and speak about it with passion and get stuck in, and don't try and then leave it all and do it all in the last 6 weeks. The university's ministers, the ministers of all departments who are most successful are very clear from the outset, very upfront, very courageous, don't equivocate, and they are leaders, not followers of their own careers. I believe, and I think many people here do, that we have a great universities minister. Thank you, Chris Skidmore, for sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.